In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into Slack's Block Kit, which is a JSON-based framework that helps you build static and interactive messages for your Slack apps. I published a blog post about this that you can find in the video description below. And in this video, we'll take a look at some examples using Slack's Block Kit builder, and then we'll also look at how you can handle interactivity from those messages in a Next.js API route. So let's get started. So in the first part of this video, I wanted to start by explaining what Slack's Block Kit builder is and how it can help you develop Slack notifications. So the Block Kit builder is a web-based UI for constructing these JSON payloads and then previewing them in real time. So over on the right-hand side here, you can see we just have some JSON data. Then in this middle pane, you can see the message get rendered in real time based on this payload. And then over here on the left, we can actually use this to interactively construct Slack notifications. So if we wanted to add another image or something like that, we can click image and then we can see that that's going to get added to the JSON payload and then rendered down here below. Now, in addition to this rendering preview functionality, we can also actually test send some of these messages. So if you're logged into Slack, you can look up here and you should see all of the Slack workspaces that you have access to. You can pick one. And then if you want to send a particular message to Slack, you click send to Slack, pick the channel that you want to send it to and send. And then you should see that appear over here on the right-hand side. So the first thing that I want to point out as a part of this is that Block Kit JSON format is really at the end of the day, just JSON. We have this containing object with these curly braces, and then inside of that, we have this blocks key. And that blocks key is always going to be an array. So we have an array of other objects that are called blocks, and these blocks make up the structure of this interface. So we have an array with blocks inside of it that can be nested inside one another, as we can see in some of these examples. And so at the end of the day, this is really just JSON. But this is a pretty tough example to work through. So I'm going to hop out to the blog post real quick and copy a simpler example that we can look at to sort of start to parse some of this through. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time unpacking this basic text section. So this type of block is called a section, and then it also has this text key that is an object with a type of plain text and then the actual text that's going to get rendered. Now we have an additional configuration option we can throw on here, which is to add emoji support. So if we say emoji, colon, and then this is going to be a Boolean, we say true, that's going to render any emojis that appear in this text string. So say we wanted to find a check mark emoji, we can come out to Slack, do colon, and then we'll start sort of looking at their emoji codes. Say we want to use this white check mark. So we'll come back into our text here and then just say white check mark, and then another colon, and then that should render for us. And so we got a couple of other options as well to stylize text. We're right now using the section type block, but we can also make this a header block by specifying header. And what that does is obviously bolds the text a little bit. It's still going to accept that emoji option and render for us, but makes that particular block stand out a little bit more. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove this emoji option, and I'm going to switch this back to section because there's one more way that we can stylize text. We can also use something called Markdown, which is spelled a little bit differently in Slack land. So it's MRKDWN, and this is Slack's own sort of internal Markdown format that is different than regular Markdown. So I'm going to call that out. We got a great post on the blog about this that I'll link to in the description. But just to call out, this isn't regular Markdown, although some of the principles are the same. So say, for example, I wanted to make this word bold. I can throw some asterisks around it. And we can do that and say I wanted to strike through something. For example, I could throw some tildes right here, and that's going to apply that formatting to just that piece of text. So depending on what type of text you're trying to create or stylize, you have a bunch of different options. You can use section with plain text, section with markdown, or you can make something a header block if it really needs to stand out. So in addition to styling text blocks, there's also something that we can do to sort of affect the layout of these text sections. So the section block will also accept another property called fields. And fields is going to be an array. And then inside of this fields array are going to be some objects. And each one of these objects is just going to kind of be like, the text object above. So we'll say type. And then for this example, we'll just do plain text. And then and sometimes this interface can get a little jumpy. And so we'll say type plain text, and then we'll say, the text will actually be, we'll say column 1. Because that's ultimately what's going to happen here, is that this section is going to be laid out like a column. And so if we copy this here, let's add another field right below that and just call that column 2. You can see how we can sort of start to align and lay out these different text elements in some interesting ways. Okay, so now that we've covered some basic text examples, let's see how we would handle media. So I'm going to hop out to the blog post, scroll down until I see adding images and video, and I'm just going to copy this JSON example and hop back in here. We should just be able to paste this in here as the first item in that block, and then we can see that that's going to get rendered. So let's take a look at the image block, which is type image. It's also going to accept this block ID property where you give it an image ID, and then it's required that you pass an image URL to something that's publicly accessible, right? This needs to be a URL on the internet on a CDN somewhere that Slack can load on the side. There's also, I believe, an option to pass a Slack file in here as well. So if you had an image that you uploaded to Slack, you could do that too. And alt text is obviously also required. So that's an image block. And then let's take a look right below that at a video block. So I'm going to copy that JSON snippet, and then we'll come back in here and let's paste that right below our image and just see what that looks like. So there we're passing a block with type video. It takes this title property that we can pass as plain text. And then that's going to get rendered right there for us. The title URL, we're going to pass that as well. And then it also gets this description. So plain text, Slack is your nifty way to communicate with your team. We've got a video URL, some alt text, options for thumbnail URL, author name, and provider icon URL. So that's all stuff that's getting rendered right there if you're trying to render a particular video. Okay, so now that we've talked about how to handle images in video, let's take a look at a larger, more complex, and a little bit more real world of an example. So if we come down here into the blog post and we scroll down to, this example Slack notification for an error monitoring platform, we can go ahead and just copy this JSON payload and let's paste that into BlockKit Builder. So we'll do that, we'll copy, paste, and then that should render for us. And that's going to look like this. And so we can walk through these different sections and talk about what they are, even though a lot of this you've seen already. So for example, we're using a header, to call out that this is an alert. Then we've got some different sections using Markdown to style different things. We're using fields here to sort of do some formatting. We've got an image block over here that shows, the application usage graph. And then we have a section with a link. And so this is actually a good example of something where Slack's Markdown format and traditional Markdown format differ. So I think links, as we begin to transition to talking about interactivity in Slack messages, links are sort of an underrepresented example of interactivity. So if we scroll down here, you can see, what a sort of basic link looks like. But in this example, where we have this application monitoring platform, we could also provide them a much more detailed link using query string parameters, right? So if we had, filtering set up in our application based on these query strings, we could send this to the user. And so instead of just sending them to the dashboard, we could send them to the dashboard and filter all of the servers to, say EC2 small, for example, and then all of the error types to warn and error. So depending on how you've crafted the interactions between Slack and your application, you can do some really interesting things and provide users, basically one click experiences where they get this really detailed view in your application directly from Slack. So definitely as you're starting out, think about links and, think about URL filtering, using query parameters and how you could maybe use those two things together, because there's a big difference between being taken directly to the dashboard and to a specific view of the dashboard, just depending on the type of error. So something to consider. But I'm going to scroll back up here and we'll look at a couple of other things in this example that are worth calling out. So really everything up until we get to this divider, which is basically this horizontal rule right here, we've already sort of talked about. But after this divider, this is where our notification starts to become interactive. And we can see here that we have this user select object over here that is going to allow us to select a Slack user. And then we also have these checkboxes down below. So let's look at how those are structured in the JSON payload. So here, the user select block is set as an accessory to this section, meaning that's going to be kind of set over to the right. And we've also given it this action ID. Now, the action ID is important because that value is one of the values that we're going to use in our application in the next step to pull some of that data out of the Slack interaction. So when a user selects somebody in Slack, Slack is going to then send that data out to our application. We're going to use that action ID to do something. And right below that, we can also see that we've introduced a new type of block called actions. And those have elements, right? Where we pass in these checkboxes and then we pass in some options. And each one of those options is going to correspond to one of the checkboxes here. And each one of those options is going to have a value that when that's checked, that's the value of that particular checkbox. And just like our action example above, this also has an action ID. So this is action ID 1, and that's something that we'll use in the back end of our application in the next step to pull some of this data out. And so let's go ahead and actually send this notification to Slack just so you can see what that looks like. So we'll send this to our projects channel. And cool. That looks pretty much like we expect, but now instead of, just having these sort of placeholder things, we have some interactive elements. So if I click this option, I can actually select myself. I can go ahead and, check these boxes as well. But there's really nothing happening on the back end. And that's what we'll set up in the next step, is that if you specify as you create your Slack application that you want to be able to handle interactivity, Slack will know that. And when you include these action-based block components in your messages, when a user interacts with them, they can send data payloads to your application. So let's see what that looks like in the next step. Okay. So now let's talk about how we can handle interactivity from our Slack messages. So I created this repository that we'll use for the rest of this tutorial. And you can find the link to it down in the description below. But basically what you'll need to do is go ahead and clone it down locally and then run through these authentication steps to get a Slack bot token. I'm not going to go over that in this video because the steps are fairly straightforward, but ultimately we're going to get that bot token and then store it in this Slack token environment variable. And as long as you do that, you should be able to boot up an application that looks like this. Hopefully I'll add some more stuff to this in the future, but this is the index page. And if we click this BlockKit examples button, it's going to take us to this BlockKit route. And as long as your Slack token is found, you should be able to use this dropdown to select a channel to send messages to. So we'll select projects here, and then you'll get these available server actions that I've built out in Next.js. So if we want to send this plain text message to Slack, we can do that, and we can see that that is going to show up here. Okay, so let's hop over and let's start looking at the code, because there's a couple of things going on here that I'm going to want to talk about. The first is just this, how this is built. So we have in here these actions, and these are the functions that are sending messages into Slack. So if you want to create your own or play around with the messages, that's where you can find it. And hopefully this blocks array should look familiar, right? This is the large array for our alert style message that we're going to be looking at here in just a second. The second piece is this route.js file. Okay. So this lives in Slack, interactive endpoint, so route.js. So basically this corresponds to localhost 3000 /Slack/interactive endpoint. And then this route handler is set up to respond to post requests. And this is the route that's going to handle all of the interactivity when we make those interactive calls with Slack messages. So the first thing that I want to do is let's actually generate a new alert message real quick. So I'm going to hop back into Google Chrome, and then I'm going to click the send alert message button. And then, okay, that's going to get pumped into our Slack channel. Now, what I want to do is let's hop back into VS Code, because right now I have this running locally, but we need to expose it to the internet. So I'm going to open up a new tab, and then I'm going to run NGROK, do HTTP, and then tell it to, bind to this local host 3000. And then we'll go ahead and click enter. And then NGROK should spit us out this public URL. So we're going to go ahead and copy that. Maybe we got to make this a little bigger to get it all. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and copy that to our clipboard. And then let's hop back into Google Chrome. There's one step that we're going to need to do as a part of our Slack app configuration. So we'll come here, all features and functionality, then we'll go to interactive components. And then what Slack requires is that we give them an endpoint to handle this interactivity. So we'll go ahead and copy this, and we'll just paste this in here. We'll paste our new NGROK URL in here and go ahead and click save. Okay, and so then we should be able to actually, let's hop back into the code, and we'll navigate back to the local terminal session. Okay. And so now what should happen is as we sort of click these actions, right? If we reference back to our message here, we have, these checkbox actions. We also somewhere have this user select option. And so now let's go ahead and test this out. So let's say I want to select a team member, and let's run through what's going to happen. So when Slack makes that post request to this endpoint, we're going to basically unpack that payload. We're going to extract the payload from the form data, which is using the key payload. And then we're going to sort of take out the channel. We're going to take out the actions, and then we're going to look at the individual actions. And so the first thing we're going to do is check what type of action this is. So if it's the user select action, then we're going to take out the selected user ID, and then we're basically going to post a message. So let's go and look at what that looks like. So if we come down here, I believe that's lib post message. We'll do that here. Oh, nope, I'm sorry. This is actually all defined in this route.js file. So we have post message down here, which accepts a channel ID, text, and the selected user ID. And then basically all we're going to do is just pass in a link that's going to tag that user. So again, that's using Slack's markdown format. We're adding that selected user ID and then basically saying, hey, you've been assigned an incident. So let's go ahead and test that out and see if that works. Great. And so we can see that for a second that spins. And then, yeah, our new message now makes its way to our local server. This route processes that, taps into the user's select, looks at the selected user ID, then posts a message back to that channel, tagging that user saying, hey, you've been assigned an incident. So that's sort of step one. Now, step two is we have these other checkboxes. So now that I've been assigned an incident, we also may want to sort of get status updates back to Slack. So what we're doing in this second if statement is we're looking for the actions.type if they equal checkbox, right? So if we come back out here, we scroll down to our type, right? So it's keying off of that in the payload. So if the action type equals checkboxes, then this is a little bit more complicated because we're doing a lot of stuff here. But basically what we're doing is we're looping through those blocks and looking at which ones have been selected. And if they have been selected, we're applying this strike through formatting, right? So we're extracting all of the blocks that are a part of that payload. Okay, so and then we're looping through them. And so if that current block equals the block that's a part of the action, then we're going to sort of loop through those elements, right? And then if that option is selected, right, where we have this options.selected options array. So if basically we're saying here, if the current block that we're looping through is a part of the already selected options, then we're going to return true, return false. And then we use that Boolean down here to apply some strike through formatting if it doesn't already have it, right? So here we're just saying, does the option text already have this, tilde formatting? And then if it does, then we return this and, we return the basic text. And if not, then we go ahead and format it. Or if it's not selected, then we replace it. And then what we're doing is we're actually just updating this existing message with a new set of checkboxes. So if we look down at this update message function, we can see that we're using the timestamp, which is basically the unique identifier for that particular message. It's passing in the channel ID, the timestamp in a new set of blocks, and we're just updating this section of the message in place. So as I click these checkboxes, you can see it spins, and then we get back a new message with some strike through formatting applied, and we can actually also see some console logging happen there. And so let's do that again. We see some spinning, strike through formatting gets applied, and then say if we remove this, we're doing that and removing the strike through formatting. But in reality, we're really just updating this section of the message in place. So we're just taking the blocks that we had, applying some new formatting to them, and then using this update message function to update those blocks in place. Okay, so that's in a nutshell how you would begin to create interactive Slack applications. Now there's a lot of other things that we could do inside of this route handler. And perhaps I have a database as a part of my application. I have another system somewhere that I also want to update. So when I assign a user, I don't just ping them in Slack. I might also actually assign them in a database somewhere else. So there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with this, but hopefully this should get you started. And if you have any questions or anything, be sure to leave them down in the video comments. Awesome. Now that you've had a chance to look at a couple examples of BlockKit in action, hopefully you can see how powerful it is. Even just taking the basic interactivity that we worked on today, there's a ton of room to add additional functionality and build some really cool applications that sit on top of Slack. So as always, we're really obsessed with sending notifications and hope that we help you send better Slack notifications by watching this video. So thanks for watching. Knock on.